So, after director Naoki Hamaguchi said Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 would be more concise, we have been left with questions. So does this mean Square Enix are going to cut major story content from the finale? But it turns out the truth is a lot more interesting. In reality, Hamaguchi wasn't talking about cutting things out, he was talking about fixing the pacing. And I'm going to say it, considering how bloated parts of Rebirth felt, this might be exactly what the trilogy needs to have a chance of ending on a high note. So the confusion started when Hamaguchi told Screen Rant that Part 3 would feel more concise than Rebirth. A lot of people took that as code for smaller game, less story, and maybe cut content. But in a follow-up interview with VGC, he clarified what he actually meant. Quote, "It's about improving the pacing and making sure the story developments move forward at the right speed rather than feeling slow and drawn out." He also said, "It's not about cutting content, it's about making sure the pacing feels right." So to be clear, the next game isn't going to be shorter, it's just aiming to be tighter. Hamaguchi even said he was happy with how Rebirth turned out overall, but that he's listening to players who felt the pacing could be smoother. Now personally, and I know I'm not alone here, I think Rebirth's biggest pacing issue didn't come solely from the expanded story. The expanded story was hit and miss for me, some of it worked well, other bits clearly felt like unnecessary bloat. But the real issue was the side content overload. Rebirth was absolutely packed with distractions, fetch quests, side hunts and minigames, all spread out across huge open zones. On paper that might sound great, but in practice it felt like it regularly killed the momentum between key story moments. You'd go from emotional cutscenes straight into a long stretch of side tasks that completely derailed the tension, and by the time you got back to the main plot, that emotional connection had cooled off. Remake Part 1 actually worked better in this area. Midgar was dense and contained, there was still bloat, but you tended to move from moment to moment with purpose, and it did not lose that sense of urgency so consistently. Don't get me wrong, Rebirth's world was gorgeous, and some of the side content was fun, but it came at the cost of pacing. And when you are adapting one of the most emotional stories in RPG history, that pacing really matters. So what could Hamaguchi's comments actually mean in practice? Well, I think that Part 3 will keep all of the story content from the original, Meteor, the Northern Crater, and the final confrontation with Sephiroth, but will structure it in a much more streamlined way. Think fewer distractions between big events and more cinematic momentum. The team might pull back on massive open world zones and return to more focused linear environments for the finale. That wouldn't be a downgrade necessarily, it would fit the tone of where the story goes. The final act of FF7 should feel desperate, emotional and urgent, not like you're checking side quest boards constantly. It's also likely that optional content will still exist, but hopefully placed more naturally, maybe as post-game material or optional detours that don't slow down the main story. Hamaguchi's focus on immersion makes me think we'll get smoother transitions between major story beats and fewer interruptions that break tension. Essentially, same scope, better flow. Now, Hamaguchi also said something really interesting in a separate interview, this time with Games Radar. He confirmed that Square Enix is actively considering DLC for Part 3, or possibly even another full game set up in the remake universe once the trilogy wraps up. Now that's notable because remember, they skipped DLC for Rebirth entirely. The team originally had ideas for it, but decided to focus all resources on finishing the trilogy first, which honestly was the right move. These are massive games already, and Rebirth became a bit of a slog by the end anyway. But it does raise an interesting question. If Part 3 does get DLC, will it be genuine new content created after release, or will it be story ideas that were trimmed out of the main game and sold later as premium extras? I really hope it's the former. We've already seen Square's experiment with this before. Integrated Yuffie episode was well done, and if they do DLC for Part 3, I'd love to see it as optional side stories, maybe a playable Vincent mission or something set after the ending, rather than expanding chapters from the main narrative. It also sounds like Square isn't ready to close the door on Final Fantasy VII entirely. Hamaguchi said they're watching how the franchise performs culturally after the trilogy wraps up, because it's clear the remake project has reignited global interest in FF7. Spin-offs aren't off the table. He even hinted that things are really up in the air. So who knows, maybe we'll see other games focusing on characters like Yuffie, Naoki or Barrett. Personally, I'd be totally up for that as long as it doesn't compromise the trilogy's ending. So, here's the takeaway. Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 isn't being cut down, it's being fine-tuned. Hamaguchi wants to deliver the same amount of story, just with stronger pacing and better immersion. And if Square decides to do DLC after the trilogy, hopefully it's for the right reasons, to expand the world and not carve it up. But what do you think? Would you rather see Square Enix keep the finale self-contained and complete, or would you welcome post-launch DLC if it told extra stories in the same universe? Let me know your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed the discussion, leave a like to help more fans find it, and thank you for watching.